Biglino argues that the Bible was never meant to tell about God. Biglino states that after 2,000 years of research, we still do not know who are the original authors of the Bible. We have many copies of the Bible, very different among each other, which were written throughout the span of many centuries. We do not know the original text of the Bible nor how it was read, but we still claim that those who wrote the Bible were inspired by God. Biglino argues that the Bible is one of the many books that humanity has written in the course of its history. The Bible is a set of books in which the people of Israel intended to write the events of their history and the relationship of this people with their governor, whom the Bible knows by the name of Yahweh. So, it is a story of a small people who lived in a small territory, the story of Israel and their governor. The governor Yahweh was then artificially turned into a spiritual god by the theologians of the following centuries. Probably one of the major issues, argues Biglino, is not that we do not know the authors, nor that the Bible was edited thousands of times by hundreds of different copyists, but that we do not know how to read the Hebrew Bible in the first place. The original Hebrew Bible does not contain vowels, and therefore the meaning of the words can only be guessed through context. Vowels were added 1,000 years later to make the reading process simpler, but the Hebrew Bible remains a work of guesswork, uncertain in both religious and literal interpretation. Biglino shows that this word, literally TVL, can be either written as and produced Tevel to mean world universe, or either, if we add one more dot, becomes Tevel, which means abomination, perversion. Due to this, very simple mistakes can create huge contradictions in the Bible or may induce its believers into doing or believing the wrong things. Biglino asserts that his translations follow one single rule. Let's pretend that what is written in the Bible and what the authors wrote is 100% accurate without any theological interpretation. Because theologians, argues Biglino, follow the same rule. They are pretending that the Bible is talking about a spiritual God, and they have modified this book to make it fit their religious narrative. Biglino's main thesis is based on the translation of a few core terms. He proposes a reading of the Bible through substitution of the theological or uncertain terms with their Hebrew transliterations, and by following this guide, you can verify his statements with a physical Bible or online Bible on your own. According to Biglino, when reading the Bible we should substitute God with Elohim, substitute Lord or Eternal with Yahweh, substitute Most High with Elyon, the leader of Elohim, substitute Almighty God with El Shaddai, substitute Spirit with Ruach, substitute Glory with Kavod. According to Biglino, the term God is the unjust theological translation of the term Elohim, a plural term meaning gods, often singularly used as Eloha, related to El, who became Allah to the Muslims. The plurality of this term is considered a majestic plural by theologians, which Biglino refutes, stating that the correct translation remains uncertain. Elohim, based on the context, may either refer to Yahweh or foreign deities like the Moabite god Chemosh, the Sidonian goddess Astarte, angels or mortals such as judges or kings. How possible is it that Yahweh was a simple king made God by his people? A bit like King Xerxes I for the Persians, or like the pharaohs for the ancient Egyptians. Is this a case of euhemerism? A true story exaggerated to the point it became a legend? According to Biglino, some parts of the Bible can prove it, like Deuteronomy 32, 8-9 and 12. In Deuteronomy 32:8, following the rules of Biglino, we substitute Most High with Elyon, which means the one that stands above, representing the highest military rank, the general. In the oldest Hebrew texts, it is not written that it was divided among the sons of Israel, but among the sons of the Elohim. Therefore, Elyon was dividing the territory among the sons of Elohim. Yahweh, in this division, was assigned the people of Israel, because other territories were assigned to other Elohim, like Chemosh, Milcom, Dagon, Astarte. In Deuteronomy 32:12, we notice that Yahweh alone led Israel. No other foreign god Elohim was with Yahweh. How can there be other foreign gods when Yahweh is supposed to be the only God? In the first commandment of the Hebrew Bible, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me," Yahweh clearly knows that there are other gods Elohim ruling other territories, and he wants you to only follow him. According to Biglino, the Psalm 82:1 is the nail in the coffin to the theologian theory of the plural majestatis. where Yahweh takes place in a divine council among other gods, Elohim, which proves that Elohim is not one but many, because obviously God cannot sit alone in the divine council. God being all-powerful and all-knowing, according to Biglino, are theological concepts based on extra-philosophical conjectures for God to be the creator of the universe. But these concepts, in many cases, are disproven by the Bible itself. In Genesis 18:1-2, Biglino states that in Hebrew, there's no concept of appear from nothing. The Hebrew verse means to come physically. If it were to be true that God appears, why does he need water to clean his feet? Did his feet get dirty because of the sand? Why does God need to drink, eat, and take rest like mortals? And when God reveals that he's thinking about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 18:20-21, Abraham tries to convince God to not kill the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, stating, "What if there are 50 good people in Sodom and Gomorrah? Will you kill everyone if you know that there are good people among bad people?" And God replies that if he finds 50 good people in Sodom and Gomorrah, he will forgive everyone. And Abraham, "What if there are 45? Will you kill them anyway?" God replies, "No." Abraham, "What if there are 40? And Abraham keeps dealing until he convinces God not to kill anyone if he finds 10 good people in Sodom and Gomorrah. "If I find, I will spare the whole place." And Biglino asks, if God is all-knowing, why does the Bible say that he does not know how many good people there are in Sodom and Gomorrah? Cannot God see in the soul of the people? Why is this out of his control? Then Biglino adds, good people, as mentioned in Genesis 17:10-12, means circumcised people, which is the symbol of the alliance with Yahweh, and therefore, Yahweh must check everyone to see if they are circumcised. This explains why Yahweh does not know how many people are good, because the circumcision is a hidden symbol of his alliance. Biglino states with reference to Samuel 15:2-3 that it should be clear by now that Yahweh is a military general, not concerned with love and compassion, but war and utilitarianist methods to defend and expand the land of Israel, no matter how much blood is shed. Biglino's literal reading and interpretation of the Hebrew Bible is the most controversial part of his research. According to theological interpretation and deeming everything true and realistic, like Jesus walking on water, leads Biglino into believing that an unknown civilization called Elohim may have arrived on our planet and shared their DNA with us when we were still apes to continue their species. All the ancient civilizations tell us that the sons of the stars created us, states Biglino when comparing the Hebrew Bible with other scriptures and mythologies. Biglino argues that the biblical Hebrew has no words that describe the concept of creating from nothing and the concept of eternity, and that the Bible starts with Bereshit, which means in the beginning of this story, not the beginning of the world. Biglino argues that in the beginning, an unknown species called Elohim came to our planet, and that they created a fenced botanical garden with all kinds of fruits in Eden, located between Anatolia and the Caspian Sea. The Elohim then took Adam from the outside world. They did not create Adam and put him to work in it, creating Eva through clonation of his DNA from the rib or iliac crest, because Adam was having sexual intercourse with all the animals in the Garden of Eden. According to Biglino, the Elohim created men with their selem, which is something material that contains their image, which was salam, cut or extracted from the young male Elohim. The Elohim were purifying their blood, extracting their selem, then injecting it into the Homo erectus to create the Homo sapiens. Or probably, the Elohim, mentioned as the sons of God in Genesis 6:1-2, may have shared their DNA through sexual intercourse with our ancestors. Early humans lived over 900 years, but when the Elohim stopped sharing their DNA, the human lifespan dropped to 120. Biglino argues that there's not only one Garden of Eden, but many, one of which is the Garden of Alcinous, described by Homer in the Odyssey, where there was no summer or winter. The food was being produced continuously and artificially. Biglino states that the Elohim modified many crops, like the wheat, which was inedible 10,000 years ago, to make it suitable for human consumption, and injected with agrobacterium, the potatoes in South America for the same reason. Even sheep were created genetically, argues Biglino. Don't you find it odd that the sheep require men to survive? If we do not cut their wool every 3 months, they die of suffocation because their wool grows continuously. The sheep were created for us. A peculiar characteristic of the Elohim is that they love the aroma of burnt fat, as mentioned in Leviticus 3:16, which is the same aroma that the ancient Greek gods loved to smell during offerings, a characteristic that is spread all over ancient Greek mythology and other mythologies. Another important aspect is the advanced technology used by the Elohim in the Bible. In Exodus 33:18, Moses asks to see the glory of God. Biglino states that glory should remain untranslated as kayod, and the context will give us the meaning. From the context, the kayod of God is a physical vehicle that is so powerful that kills whoever sees it. And God cannot control his kayod. As a consequence, when Moses comes down from the mountain, his face is burnt because of the exposure. In Exodus 16:10, the kavod is seen in a cloud, which means that his kavod can also fly. In the book La Caduta degli Dei by Mauro Biglino, he states that the cherubim are vehicles similar to flying motorcycles on which the Elohim sit, that the seraphim are generators of light inside the homes of the Elohim, and that the Ark of Covenant is a generator of electricity. In multiple occasions, states Biglino, the Elohim use weapons of mass destruction, like nuclear bombs, biological and chemical weapons. One example, he thinks, is the destruction of Ur and Sodom and Gomorrah, which is described in Genesis 19:12-29. The Bible, according to Biglino, is one of the many books written by an ancient civilization. The Bible calls our creators Elohim. The ancient Greeks call them Theoi. The Sumerians call them Anunnaki. The Norwegian mythology calls them Aesir, and they are known as Viracocha in the Inca mythology. You may either believe that the content of these books is false and pure fantasy, but how is it possible that everyone came to the same conclusion? Why does every ancient civilization mention that we came from above, from the sons of the stars? Biglino states, we should take into consideration the literal side of the Bible void of its theological interpretation because there are many Elohim in the Bible and there is no God. The literal side of the Bible proved to be fundamental in analyzing the historical events of our past. We discovered the Hittite civilization because it was mentioned in the Bible. It is important to keep our mind open because no matter how absurd something may seem, what matters is obtaining more answers. Heinrich Schliemann was mocked and ridiculed for believing the Iliad and Odyssey were telling a true story, but when he discovered Troy, the city contended by the Trojans and Achaeans in the Iliad, everyone shut up. Heinrich Schliemann found Troy because of the let's pretend that method. If he was as arrogant as the other archaeologists, now Troy would not be discovered. The Hebrew Bible, states Biglino, is a book that has nothing to do with us. It should be relatable only to the Hebrew people. It is a book they wrote for themselves. This book was then improperly adopted, reread, reinterpreted, and re-explained by theologians. The more we read the Bible and the more we study theology, the more we understand that theology talks as if the Bible did not exist. What keeps the church alive is that the Bible, despite being the most solid book in the world, is also the least read of all. And those few people who read it read only a few chapters or verses, and unfortunately, already with the filters of theological education. In his book, Il Falso Testamento, there is a chapter titled Biblical Horror, where Biglino lists some of the scariest and heartbreaking parts of the Bible. Numbers 31:17-18, where God asks to kill everyone and enslave virgin women for themselves. And lastly, Numbers 31:35-40, where, after the war with the Midianites, God receives spoils of war in the amount of 675 sheep, 72 cattle, 61 donkeys, and 32 virgin women. Why does an all-powerful, all-knowing, and self-sufficient God need animals and 32 virgin women? Let the believers answer, states Biglino. The research of Mauro Biglino has been refuted on many occasions by Hebrew and Christian theologians and scientists. Here are some of the most common points. Hebrew scholars agree that the term Elohim refers to God who is a spiritual God. The term is plural because it may represent the transition from the polytheist belief, the belief in many deities, to monotheism, the belief in the only one God, Yahweh. Thousands of translators have translated the Hebrew Bible through history, and many translators are revising the Bible in light of new discoveries every day. The evilness of God in the Bible may be justified as actions that God needs to perform for the better good for His creation. Many scientists agree with Biglino that the Bible was written by the Hebrew people to talk about their civilization like many societies before. But scientists disagree both with religious scholars and Biglino on the validity of the Bible and any other holy book as a source of knowledge and research. Both the religious belief of creationism in the Bible and the theory of the ancient astronauts proposed by Biglino ignore the scientific theory of evolution by natural selection, which is agreed by the scientific community to explain clearly how life developed on our planet. Archaeologists argue that there are no remains of an alien civilization on our planet, like the kavod, the ruach, or the vehicles used by the so-called Elohim. Advancing this hypothesis may actually diminish the unknown techniques that our ancestors adopted in building megastructures like pyramids, ziggurats, and monoliths. A famous Italian chemist, Dario Bressanini, refuted the alien wheat theory by Biglino. This theory states that the Elohim genetically modified the wheat 10,000 years ago to make it suitable for human consumption. Dario Bressanini states that DNA mutations of wheat and other plants happen randomly and can't be proven to be linked to aliens. The nail in the coffin to Mauro Biglino's theories, argue his enemies, could probably be his superficial non-academic research methodology, which we can demonstrate with this last claim of his. Biglino, in a public debate in Turin, showed a picture of the Temple of Luxor in Egypt, which seems to portray a spermatozoon coming out of the penis of the god Amun-Ra. How could the ancient Egyptians know about the shape of the spermatozoa thousands of years before the invention of the microscope? Biglino argues this to be an irrefutable proof that the aliens were giving their technology to ancient civilizations. Very soon, though, his theory was refuted by Egyptologist experts who interpreted the sentence for him. The pictograms represented are respectively an ox horn at the bottom and an amphora that is pouring water on the ox horn, the meaning of which is purification. This pictogram belongs to a whole sentence, a sentence that is written from the top to the bottom and represents an offering from Pharaoh Alexander the Great, when Alexander was crowned Pharaoh of Egypt, to the deity Amun-Ra. The sentence means, perform a purification with 5 grains of incense from Upper Egypt, Southern Egypt. Scientifically speaking, the theories proposed by Biglino belong to the pseudoscientific hypothesis of the ancient astronauts, who came to our planet in prehistoric times and gave origin to the human species through their DNA or clonation. These claims seem to be related to the realist religion created in the 1970s in France, which believes that the Elohim have historically been mistaken with the gods of the Hebrew Bible, and that the prophets Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, and Rael have been trying to guard humans from technological developments to avoid nuclear apocalypse, and, once peace is achieved, the Elohim will return to exchange their technologies with the humans and establish a utopia.
I will tell you about a very simple concept, but very respectful of the way of reading the so-called sacred text. Then we will start from here with a series of short videos with the aim of obtaining very simple indication for a respectful reading of the Bible, as respectful as possible towards the ancient authors. In this way, we could do an autonomous reading, and we could get an idea of what the Bible probably tells us beyond what theology has told us instead. At the beginning, of course, I would also like to give you some indications relating to the absolute uncertainty that we have when we approach that text. I mean the awareness of the fact that we know very little about that text. To develop this topic, it is interesting to read some concepts expressed by Professor Garbini, professor at the La Sapienza University of Rome, professor of Semitic philology. Professor Garbini argues that Hebrew is a Canaanite dialect South Phoenician. Actually, Hebrew is one of the many dialects within the Canaanite languages. We only know Hebrew as it was reconstructed at the end of the first millennium after Christ, the so-called Masoretic Hebrew. At that time, the important thing was not to know the linguistic structure of those texts, but the theological implications deriving from the various currents of Judaism. This means that when we read the Bible, we do not read a text that followed grammar rules, but we read a text that followed an ideological path, and the grammatical rules were not a problem for the authors. This is important because over the centuries, many grammatical rules have been developed. For example, those relating to the term Elohim, which from plural witches must absolutely become singular. The linguistic and grammatical rules have therefore been elaborated after. So we know only one of interpretation of the biblical text, that of the school of Tiberias, which produced Masoretic Hebrew. The Hebrew language in the beginning it was expressed through the consonants of the Phoenician language. Hebrew was written without vowels. We will never know how the Bible was originally read. The vowel sounds were introduced by the school of Tiberias between the 6th and 9th centuries after Christ.
Da parte degli assirologi che si sono basati sulle forme recenti delle lingue semiti.
Professor Garbini says that when we speak of ancient languages, even the agreement of all scholars on the meaning of a term is not a guarantee of certainty. Based on this information, what we can honestly do is try to do a literal reading of the Bible. Regarding the term Elohim, in the face of all these uncertainties, I think the best thing to do is what I will tell you shortly. Elohim is actually a term that you don't know how to translate. For this reason, it is translated in many ways. For example, it is translated with the term God, but the Jewish exegetes themselves say that in the Hebrew language there is no term that indicates God as we understand it, as an omniscient, omnipotent, transcendent spiritual entity that is to be worshipped. Elohim is also translated as judges, legislators, governors, the bright ones from above, and so on. All these terms that are used actually indicate the functions that this Elohim performed, but do not say who they really were. The Elohim were certainly judges, they were certainly legislators, they were certainly governors, but who they really were and what the term Elohim really means, we don't know. This is the fundamental thing. Since we don't know, we must have the correctness to say it. Here in Genesis 20:13, we see one of the examples relating to those uncertainties I mentioned earlier, that concerns the term Elohim and the verbs that are used. This is the passage where Abraham tells his story and tells when the Elohim brought me out of my father's house. Then you see that here the verb is translated in the plural form. This is the Bible translated for scholars who know the Hebrew language. This is the guide of the verbal forms present in the Old Testament, and also here it is said that the verb it is in the plural form in the third person. So it is certain that the verb connected to the term Elohim is plural. But in the Bibles translated for families, the verb is theologically translated into the singular because the term Elohim must indicate God, and so it must have the verb in the singular even if it is plural in Hebrew. As you can see, the Bibles translated for scholars respect the letter of the Hebrew text, while the Bibles translated for families contain theological translations, that is, they must convey an idea, a different concept from what is written in the original Bible.
La Bibbia di Lutero, la Bibbia di Gerusalemme, la Bibbia concordata, la Bibbia nella versione di Giacomo, insomma la Bibbia inglese nella versione di Re.
All these Bibles are translated for the public, and therefore they have the translation of verb in the singular form. Luther's Bible, the Jerusalem Bible, the Bible of the German Bishops' Conference, the King James Bible, the Septuaginta, that is the Bible translated into Greek, the Bible published by the House of the Geneva Bible. All this derives from the fact that Elohim must be translated with the singular term God.
Ce ne sono alcune che pongono attenzione al tema. Per esempio, la Bibbia dei testimoni di Geova traduce il verbo al singolare, dice: e avvenne che quando Dio...
The Bible of Jehovah's Witnesses translates the verb into the singular, but in the note it says that in reality the verb is plural.
Fecero errare, plurale, per accordarsi con Elohim, che è plurale, che il verbo è al...
Various commentators from different schools try to explain why this plural verb must be translated into the singular. But each time they are explanations that always have the purpose of affirming that Elohim refers to the one God. I don't want to go into the merits of all the explanations that have been worked out to try to prove that Elohim is singular. To refute them, it is sufficient, for example, to take Psalm 82, which clearly speaks of an assembly of the Elohim, and follow what Professor Manuel Tov of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem says.
Ma corrispondono in realtà a tre individui diversi.
He says that the various ways used by Hebrew to indicate the term we translate with God actually refer to different people, and the terms are El, Elyon, and Yahweh. El is probably one of the singular forms of the term Elohim. The other form is Eloah.
Questa è, come dire, una radice che ritorna. Per esempio, in aramaico
In Aramaic we have Elaha. In Syriac language we have Alaha. In Arabic we have Ilah, to then get to identify the unique God with Allah. The Arabs say La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasulallah. There is no God apart from Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. We still remember that even the Jews tell us that we will never know how the Bible was read because there were no vowels. As you can understand, all these terms, if they are considered without the vowels, they are all very similar. So we are faced with the same category of individuals, also from the point of view of the name.
Teniamo presente che quando l'ebraico è stato vocalizzato, Allah si stava diffondendo rapidamente nel Mediterraneo e quindi chissà che magari certe vocalizzazioni. Allora nel mondo del non sapere
So we saw that from the point of view of the meaning of nouns, from the point of view of the use of verbs, from the point of view of uncertainties in the translations, we are faced with a situation in which we don't know. So, in this situation of not knowing, what we can do? A very simple thing. To read the Bible respectfully, I think it is right not to translate the term Elohim, the term El, the term Eloah. And when in the Bibles we have at home, we find the term God, we can replace it with the term Elohim, thus leaving the word used by the biblical authors. So we will understand that without entering into useless discussions and with the utmost respect for the biblical authors, if you read the Bible while keeping the terms they use, we will realize that we are faced with a Bible different from the one we are told, but a Bible much more fascinating, much more concrete, much more understandable, but above all, much more logical than what we are told. At this point, I give you an appointment here in the videos with my friend Paul Wallis to address other indications about the most respectful way to read the Bible. Ciao from Italy.
I'm very happy to be in conversation with Mauro on these topics because my own research journey in the Eden series had brought me to very similar conclusions, and it was initially the issues around the word Elohim, the plural form of the word Elohim, that broke me out of my old world of narrow Christian orthodoxy to a point of view from which I can see that the Bible is not a book about God in the way I thought it was, but it is actually representative of a kaleidoscope of entities from the beginning of the Hebrew canon to the very end. Now, the word Elohim is the Bible's oldest word that gets translated as God, but as Mauro has pointed out, it is a masculine plural form that takes plural verb forms. And as I began drilling down into those questions, I realized that the problems thrown up by the plurality of that word are not just a grammatical glitch, they represent an earlier form of the story in which Elohim was understood to represent a diversity of beings. There is a body in the Hebrew canon referred to as the Sky Council, in which a number of Elohim sit in council together. Now, in my Eden books, Escaping from Eden, The Scars of Eden, and Echoes of Eden, I argue that the Elohim stories make better sense if we do just as Mauro just said, and read them with the word Elohim still in place, or if we use a root meaning, the powerful ones. When we read the stories that way, the stories change, but not in a random way. They change in a way that resolves many of the moral questions we would have over the Elohim stories, why such brutal and unconscionable things are done, how it is that human beings get slaughtered in the conflict of the Elohim, something that doesn't make sense if Elohim is translated in the singular as God. But the other thing that is revealed is that the moment you reread the stories as stories of the Elohim, the powerful ones, you quickly realize that you're reading the summary form of the source narratives from out of ancient Mesopotamia, the narratives from out of ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. I sometimes get a knee-jerk reaction from people of faith regarding what I argue for in the translation of Elohim as the powerful ones. And the knee-jerk reaction is when people of faith say, but wait a minute, we know that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So this is the Christian theology of the Holy Trinity. Surely that's why Elohim, the Bible's oldest word for God, is a plural. It must represent the persons of the Holy Trinity. Well, there are many problems to that reaction. And the first is that the Holy Trinity is a Christian doctrine. It's separated from the work and intent of the original authors by millennia. And the theology of the most recent redactors of the Hebrew canon was a monotheistic theology. They did not believe in multiple gods. And in fact, the insertion of the holy name Yahweh over earlier Elohim texts, such as we see in Genesis 3 or Genesis 11, reveals that later redactor is turning the stories of the Elohim into a story of God. And it's those adjustments that throw up many of the moral problems. Why would a holy God genocide people? Why would a loving God bomb people back into a pre-Stone Age condition from having previously been a technological civilization? This is what we read in Genesis 11. So no, it's not a representation of the Holy Trinity. And would it make any sense for thousands of human beings to get killed in the crossfire between the Elohim? Is that what happens when the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit get into a spat? Of course not. No, the original stories are about something else. Elohim, what I would argue, are powerful ones. Now, some theologians argue that when the word Elohim is understood as the powers or the powerful ones, that it doesn't specify what kind of entities they are, that this word could refer to anything more powerful and advanced than humanity, and so we shouldn't draw specific conclusions from the word. T.N.T. Clark published a theology of the Old Testament, which was modestly titled The Theology of the Old Testament. It's edited by S.D.F. Salmond, and in it they quote the theologian A.B. Davidson, and he writes these words: "In contrast to men, angels belong to the class of Elohim." Now I'll pause right there, because that's a reminder that the word Elohim gets translated in various ways through the Hebrew canon. In one place it's God, and in another place it's chieftains or judges or landlords. In another place it's angels. How can this earliest word for God be so elastic? And why would the ancients choose a word to denote the unique transcendent God, but also denote random other entities who they never define? it's slightly ill-fitting. So the quote goes on, "It might be interesting to contemplate the question of how the same name Elohim came to be applied to God and this class of beings." Agreed, good question. Then he goes on, "Perhaps we should be satisfied with the general explanation that the name, meaning powers, is applied from the standpoint of men to all that is above man, to the region lying above him." That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? "Though the same name is given, i.e. to angels and God, the two are never confounded in Scripture." Well, that's a rather disingenuous thing to say. The two are never confounded in Scripture. That's a non-explanation of why the word can mean angels here, or false gods here, or demons here, or judges here, or God over here. What's the truth of the word? And that's why I argue for rereading the Elohim texts and leaving Elohim in the text so that the shape of the stories becomes that much clearer to the modern reader. Another theologian who points to the word Elohim as representing a kaleidoscope of powerful entities is Michael Heiser. And he rightly points out that the word is far more elastic than we generally believe. But it's only a halfway explanation as to why that is the earliest designation for God. Why would God be categorized with archonic entities, other material beings? Why would there be this competition among Yahweh and the other Elohim? And it's clear in moments in the Bible, Yahweh classes himself as an Elohim. There's an occasion when his king wants a prognosis on his health, and he sends for advice from the Elohim of the people of Ekron. Yahweh gets furious and says, "Is there no Elohim here that he could consult, that he would run off and consult the Elohim of Ekron?" And it's a moment when you realize these Elohim are in competition with one another for hegemony. Go to the Ten Commandments and you've got something similar where there's a great forgetting of the other Elohim being commanded. You're not to bow down to them, you're not even to depict them. You serve only Yahweh. And then Moses' successor, Joshua, says something very similar. Cut yourself off from the Elohim the Egyptians serve and the Elohim your ancestors served on the other side of the river in Mesopotamia, and you should serve only Yahweh. So there we have a world of many powerful entities, but you serve this one. And so the Yahweh character is set among the many Elohim of the Hebrew stories. You also have stories about a sky council in which a number of Elohim sit in council together, presided over by the character Yahweh. How can you have a council where a number of those entities are fictitious, but the president of the council is real, and that's God? That's not quite coherent. We have to realize there is an earlier form of the stories prior to the 7th to 6th century BCE edit, and the original form is a world in which there are many Elohim, many powerful ones, all presiding over their own respective human colonies. Mauro and I are not the first people to point out the moral problems thrown up by reading the Elohim stories as God stories. There were some really significant church fathers at the beginning of Christianity who pointed this out very clearly and who were wishing to nudge the church away from regarding the Hebrew scriptures as foundational for Christianity. That decision had already been taken in Acts 15, reading that book, and yet the arguments had to be had all over again in the first 1, 2, 3, 4 centuries of Christianity. And Origen argued that if you read the Elohim stories as if they were God's stories and took them at face value, then you would end up believing in a God of whom you had to justify the most brutal actions. We would have to believe of God, he said, quote, such things as we would not believe of the most savage and unjust of men. So he pointed out very clearly there is a moral problem when you translate the Elohim stories as God stories. I completely agree with Mauro that when the final redaction of the Hebrew canon was done in the 7th to 6th century BCE, the agenda driving that edit was an ideological one, not a grammatical one. And that is why you can have texts where the theological problem of too many gods has been cleaned up, but the grammar's a mess. The fact that the earlier grammar of the Elohim stories survives in stories where the name Yahweh has been pasted over the top is a clue that you're not reading the original form, and a clue that the original form had more gods or advanced beings in it than the current translation wants to give away. And the shape of the henotheistic world remains. The stories don't make sense until you realize there are many powerful ones in the picture in competition with one another. When Abraham gives this explanation of why he moved from Ur of the Chaldees, he says, the powerful ones told me to move. And we have the Elohim, the plural form noun, and then told me to wander is a plural form verb. Now, the plural form verb is clear in the Hebrew. So that survived that 7th to 6th century BCE edit. But what that information does not survive is the translation into English. Because you translate it into English, and told me to is no different whether you've got a single or a plural subject of that verb. And so the translation into English hides the fact that Abraham is actually referencing many powerful entities. And this is why it's important to go back to the Hebrew to look at the translation of these words. This is the power of the work that Mauro has done, because as a translator of interlinear Bibles, he had to give a very precise rendering of each word in the Hebrew text with no interpretation, no theological orthodoxization of the text. Simply report what's in the text, and then you have the translations either side, and you can see I've got a plural form verb in the Hebrew, and it's been changed into a singular form word because the translators want this to be about God when it clearly isn't. I argue in the Eden series that when in the text the Elohim say, let us make the humans to look like one of us, they really do mean that. Look like is a very concrete term, and one of us is very clear. The plurality is emphasized there. If that word is translated as God, you've got a philosophical problem and you've got a grammatical problem. As soon as you translate Elohim as the powerful ones, the problem resolves. Elsewhere in Genesis 3, you have the Elohim arguing over how intelligent the human beings should be, and one of them says, we don't want the humans to be as intelligent as us. And once again, the conflict and the plurality of the language throws up a problem that even a child can recognize in the telling of the story from conventional family translations of the Bible. Those questions resolve as soon as you realize that you are reading a story about multiple Elohim conflicting over how intelligent human beings should be. Not a new story, it's actually a summary form of the conflict between Enlil and Enki in the ancient Mesopotamian stories. In my book, Escaping from Eden, I argue for the root meaning of the word Elohim as being the powerful ones, and suggest that when we read the stories that way, they make sense and they line up with their sources. There's a coherence to that picture which emerges. But if you don't want to follow that logic, just keep the word Elohim in the Elohim texts and reread the stories that way, and that's quite sufficient for a different shape of the story to emerge, a story that has something different to say about the world in which our ancestors lived, that gives different information about our origins and our place in the cosmos.
the final edit of the Old Testament of the Bible, the Hebrew canon included the layering of some beautiful and profound theology over the top of ancient texts. Unfortunately, mistranslating traumatic ancestral memories as if they were encounters with God is a choice with far-reaching consequences. Belief in a violent, xenophobic, hierarchical God has been used through the ages to justify violent wars and all manner of abuses. However, the fidelity which the ancient manuscripts have been curated in the Hebrew canon by countless generations of priests and scribes means that in our generation we can now return to these fascinating artifacts of our prehistory and ask how differently they might be translated.